if we want to try out that model of how affordable housing is governed, we could try that within the housing levy. I don't think we need to have a new public development authority.
Well, that's Seattle City Council member Lisa Herbel talking to me back in May about a social housing measure that at the time was just gathering signatures. Well, now it's headed towards the ballot. So is the council going to offer its own competing measure? Is I-135 simply going to stand on its own? Some important questions there. And another big question, who's our next police chief going to be? We're going to get some details on that this week. Plus, could the city finally be taking a serious look at alternatives to 911 and police responses? All that and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own. And I'm joined by none other than David Croman of the Seattle Times. And David, I wanted to ask you a Seattle sports stress meter question, if I could. Was it more stressful to watch the Mariners pull out an amazing win after blowing a 5-run lead on Sunday, or to watch Russell Wilson with his new team, the Broncos, come up just short on a comeback attempt against the Seahawks on Monday Night Football? What do you got, man?
Well, I think at my core, I am more of a Mariners fan than I am a Seahawks fan. So I'll go with the Mariners.
That was one of the craziest games in Major League this year. I don't know how that worked. But anyway, I'm glad they pulled out the win. That would have been crushing if they'd lost that. Well, thank you, David, as always, for joining me. Thanks to our listeners out there. Thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. They are on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to our patrons. Could use more of you listeners to become patrons. Please join the Mug Club at the $10 level. We can send you your very own Seattle News, Views, and Brews coffee mug. And here's the scoop, folks. We'll only have 3 of these left, so this is a hot commodity here. Make sure you get them. Plus, we will feature you on our mugshot of the week. This week, Charlotte sending in a lovely shot of her mug at what appears to be a tea nook in her home there. Excellent photo. Thank you, Charlotte. And please, patrons, send in your mugshots. We need them on the show. Email us at Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Spell it out at gmail.com. And if you listen, please do become a patron. We need you. That's Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Finally, thank you to Converge Media. The video of the podcast airs on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let her rip. It's right here, right now. Again, some developing news off the top of the show. It looks like there's some movement in the Seattle teacher strike. Class could be back in session very soon. That's some good news. And the West Seattle Bridge still on target to reopen Sunday, September 18th. So we got that going for us. But I wanted to focus on something the city council is working on this week with regard to that social housing measure we've been talking about on the podcast, I-135. It got the signatures, qualified for the ballot a few weeks ago. So the way this works, these measures go before the council. The council can vote to put them into effect, can offer their own competing measure, or just kind of let them go to the ballot. In this case, it appears the council is going with option 3, just let this thing go to the ballot. But a very interesting discussion brewing here, David. The city is trying to renew the Seattle housing levy in November of next year. So I'm looking at I-135, which looks like it's going to be on the February 2023 ballot. It would create this new public housing developer. How does that compete with the housing levy in your mind? There's some interesting politics behind the scenes here.
I mean, this was always, I think among the people who were skeptical of this measure, this was always the reason why, is they just, it's one thing to set up a structure, but another thing to fund it. I think among, Housing Development Consortium and some of the big backers of the housing levy, I think this has been one of their concerns, that the housing levy and this could sort of compete with each other for resources. The, backers of the social housing levy think it's, more the merrier, that
plenty of room in the pool. Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. But it poses an interesting question, whether having more outlets for funding will then attract more funding, or whether it is going to end up being a zero-sum thing and they're competing for scarce resources. I don't know the answer to that, but at the same time, it seems like every time there's a property tax levy of some sort on the ballot, there is someone wringing their hands about whether it's going to pass or not. And,
sure.
I remember this with the education levy. Mayor Jenny Durkin really didn't want anything on that same ballot to compete with it. And then, mostly they pass by pretty huge margins. And so, I guess I'm a little skeptical that having 2 things on the ballot at the same time related to housing, that they would cannibalize each other. But
right.
I think the larger question around, is there enough money in the system to fund this new structure, is kind of maybe the more salient one. I don't know the answer to that.
I think you're right. I think you're right. And it's interesting to see this would potentially be on the ballot in February, and the housing levy would be on the ballot in November. And it's difficult with people who have short political memories, I guess, or political forethought with voters out there. But it's something to consider here. And I wanted to bring up too, David, with this, the council has to be very careful in the public meetings, not to oppose or support any political measures. It's an ethics and elections issue. But they are bringing up one point in the resolution that considers this in the council this week. It gives us a hint about where this discussion is going. So you've got this staff analysis of I-135 that shows if it passes, the city would have to provide about $750,000 to the public developer to get it off the ground, and also conduct a feasibility study to consider transferring public lands to the public developer. Now, the dollars, put that aside for a second. Not a big number for the city, but the part that jumped out at me in the city resolution, it points out I-135 would not require the city to give priority to the public developer over other agencies like the Office of Housing, which runs the housing levy. So the dollars are one thing, but I'm also reading this as, you want to pass this measure, that's great, but that doesn't mean the city's just going to hand over its public lands. And this feels like another very important pivot point on this issue, David. Who truly gets control over public lands, and what would a yes vote on I-135 really mean?
That's all great point. I don't really know. I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, this, public lands are always sort of, this is always kind of an interesting point of discussion around what the city should do with public lands.
Yeah.
There were some changes in the state law not that long ago that allowed for excess utility and transportation lands to go towards affordable housing. It used to not be allowed to do that. And then, I remember when the city sold the Mercer mega block or whatever they called it. There was an interesting debate that around, is it better to hang on to these lands and use them for city uses in perpetuity, or is it better to sell them and then spend that money on something else? Anyway, none of that really answers your question about this. But it's that's interesting, and again, sort of goes back to the question of, if there's no guarantees of land or money on the social housing infrastructure, I mean, what is it exactly, and how does it affect change?
It's super interesting. Yeah, it's one of those things where the council cannot comment directly on these different political issues here, but there's a little bit of a comment in the background there, I think. So we'll see how that plays out. And I did want to talk about a little bit more land use with you, because the Land Use Committee has an interesting measure on the docket this week as well to, quote, remove impediments to the development of townhouses and other multifamily uses. So the council is talking about lowering the density limit for townhouses to 1 unit per 1,150 square feet, rather than the current 1 unit per 1,300 square feet in areas zoned for low-rise development in Seattle. And what struck me about this, David, is just how much of a game of inches or feet this really can be. These new regulations would allow developers to get 4 units on a subdivided property instead of just 3. And that's a big deal when you talk about adding units. But I think my bigger question is, how much more density can Seattle squeeze out of these already dense neighborhoods with townhouses out there? Your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think the answer to that question depends on who you ask. There's a fairly large contingent of people now, including on the council, I would say, would think a lot more density. And it is a game of inches, but when in inches then into this case turn to basically a 33% increase in buildable land. Not a lot of argument that Seattle needs more housing. Question about how to do that. And I think this council probably gearing up a bit for conversations around the comprehensive plan. And I think at least, some members of this council are going to want to see fairly significant changes there. But, these kinds of conversations can be seen as precursors to that, sort of warm-ups. I have a hard time imagining that people would really notice the difference between 4 units versus 3 units on a piece of property. And, if you're spending the money to develop that land already. And, in some ways, if you're trying to get more housing into Seattle, this certainly seems like an expedient way to do it.
Right, right. And I know a lot of developers are going to be, there's a public hearing on this week, folks. So they're going to be talking about this a lot. And I'm really glad you brought up the comprehensive plan, which is up for renewal in 2024, which is really not all that far away here. I think what you're talking about here, David, and help me out with this, is it the idea of we need to maximize density in areas that are already dense, or bring more density into areas that are not as dense, the traditionally more single family neighborhoods, or maybe it's both? What do you think about that dichotomy there? Because I think that's a big part of this comprehensive plan discussion.
Yeah, which is the I mean, it's sort of the urban village model versus the I don't know what you could call it,
spread it out more model. Yeah,
right,
okay.
maybe Minneapolis or Portland or something like
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
It's been interesting so that urban village model is you choose a few areas and hack a lot of density into those and basically don't do anything to the rest of the city.
Yeah.
The architect of that, Norm Rice, has said he thinks it was a good idea at the time, but recent interviews has sort of said, maybe actually this perpetuated some segregation in the city and restricted. I mean, so even the architect of that strategy is sort of questioning whether it's the best strategy at this point.
Right.
I think you're going to hear some different viewpoints on the council around this. I would expect a push for pretty aggressive, not aggressive, that's too harsh, but a push for kind of spreading out density from people like Councilmember Mosqueda and maybe Councilmember
Morales,
Lewis
for sure.
Morales, whereas you're definitely going to hear skepticism of that from Councilmember Peterson, who's pushing for kind of really building up certain areas but keeping single family zoning in others. So for my money, I think maybe this flies under the radar a little bit because it's slow moving and you're talking about zoning changes, but in some ways I think it's kind of the most significant conversation happening in Seattle right now, and could be hugely impactful. And for my money was why this last election was so important as it was, because I think Bruce Harrell being in charge of this process, or having a big say in this process, is pretty different than having Lorena Gonzalez. And so how it plays out, I think will have pretty enormous consequences for years to come, in the way that the urban village strategy has really in a lot of ways defined how Seattle is laid out. You think of Seattle, you think of Ballard, and you think of Capitol Hill, and these sort of satellite, but you kind of forget everything in between. And I think that's because of the urban village strategy. And so changes to all that in the comprehensive plan could reshape Seattle in a pretty significant way.
I think so too. And I think we're looking at something with the city council elections coming up next year, 7 seats up for grabs, and those are district seats there. So we're talking about development that's going on in those districts. So a lot still on the table there. Thank you, David, for breaking down that piece with me. All right, up next, the week we've all been waiting for. We get to meet the 3 candidates for police chief up close and personal. Who's going to get the job? We've got some details on. Now hear this. Well, at long last, we know the 3 candidates for finalists for the police chief job, the permanent job with SPD, and you're going to hear from all of them on Seattle Channel this week on Thursday evening. More details on that, I'll throw them on Twitter in just a little bit. Those candidates are Interim Chief Adrian Diaz, SPD Assistant Chief Eric Greening, and an Assistant Police Chief from Tucson, Arizona, Kevin Hall. So what's this job really going to be like for whoever gets this permanent position? The mayor spoke about this issue and how important it is to the community at a press conference about police recruiting a few months ago. Here's what he said.
We know in the 84 square miles of this city that this is a unifying element in our city. It crosses racial lines, it crosses socioeconomic lines, that people want to feel safe, and they have a right to feel safe.
David, in looking this, I'm really struck by the fact that, according to the mayor, only 15 people applied for this job after a nationwide search, and we ended up with 2 candidates from inside the SPD, including the interim chief. What does that say to you?
Well, this is speculation, of course. I don't know exactly what people's thoughts were, but it is hard to not see this as a pretty challenging job, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, the police chief job is always, for my money, one of the hardest in Seattle, because you are you're political, so you are answering to the mayor. You're hired by the mayor and the city council, and that has a very clear point of view, and you kind of have to be responsive to that. But then you're also in charge of the Seattle Police Officers Guild. I mean, not in charge of the guild, but you're the boss of its members.
Right.
So it's really this tightrope walk between two very different points of view, between the rank and file officers and the political people. And so it's a tough job.
And it's a very public job too. I mean, very much in the face of the general public, and they're getting a lot of public comments on their job all the time.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then of course it's even harder now because the department is down a huge number of officers, and the department is being made to, sort of directed to change in a certain way by the powers that be in City Hall. And but at the same time, you kind of have to calm a pretty upset workforce. There's a lot of reasons this job is hard. I think through this whole process, the baseline assumption is that this is kind of Adrian Diaz's job to lose.
The mayor has been supportive of him. Yeah, for sure.
Right. In the past, Mayor Harrell has, spoken highly of him and said he's doing a good job. And, but, that I don't think he's in any way guaranteed to get it, though. I think you can already point to a couple things that maybe haven't gone as well as Mayor Harrell wanted. Of course, I'm biased as the transportation reporter, but I do think that the parking enforcement thing has been has been a point of tension between the mayor's office and the police department generally, is my sense. I think it could legitimately be causing a little bit of rift there. I think there was that strategy briefly to declare all of Third Avenue basically a bus stop and use some of, and that didn't go very well. And in fact, Andrew Meyerberg appears to have lost his job over it.
It's been shifted around.
I don't know how large those are looming over Mayor Harrell's decision, but it's I guess I point to those mostly to say that the relationship has not been perfect by any stretch. So while I think it is probably still Adrian Diaz's job to lose, I don't think it's impossible that he could lose it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And looking at these three here, Diaz, we know he's been interim chief since Carmen Best stepped down about 2 years ago. Eric Greening with the SPD, 28 years, assistant chief of the Collaborative Policing Bureau since 2021. Kevin Hall from Tucson, there for 30 years. He set up that department's pre-arrest deflection program for nonviolent offenders that associated with substance misuse in 2018, a number of other programs too. And I guess we've touched on this issue before, David, but the top concern for whoever getting this job is what? Hiring police officers. Sure, that's out there. But then you got a police guild that doesn't have a contract. That's in the background here. You've got a lingering consent decree. What do you think that top issue is for whoever gets this permanent job as SPD chief?
Well, I think if you asked the chief, they would say, crime. Keep crime numbers down, particularly violent crime, which has gone up in Seattle. And so I would imagine that would be kind of your number one answer. I think in City Hall, in some ways, obviously sort of alternatives and other sort of responses to maybe mental health crises, those are important, but I think in some ways those are kind of more political. I mean, that's kind of more of a priority for the city council decide.
Yeah, we're going to touch on those in a second, but keep going
and fund it. But as far as day-to-day operations, I think it's hiring more officers and keeping violent crime down.
Yeah, no, those are big. And I know property crime has reared its head this year too. So there's a lot of issues that a new chief is going to have to tackle here. And I should point out the Seattle channel, I'm going to actually be asking questions that were sent in from the public through the mayor's office to these three candidates. It's happening on Thursday evening. As soon as I get exact details on when that's going to be airing, I'll make sure I get that out on Twitter, and I'll send it to all of our patrons too, so you can have that information. But David, you brought up that 911 alternatives piece, and I wanted to touch on this because the Public Safety Committee this week is looking at building an alternative 911 response system. And it's an interesting document that I found in the agenda files here, a term sheet that lays out basically what the council and mayor agree on here. They're trying to minimize surprises, they say, when it comes to policy decisions. So kind of let's keep all of our cards on the table here. And the plan says they're going to design a pilot project by December of this year and have something that can be operational in 2023. David, I saw a very carefully worded document here, but it appears to be some progress towards this goal of a 911 alternative. What do you make of what the Public Safety Committee is trying to do with the mayor's help?
That's certainly more concrete than we've had before. That said, it's, we had that press conference with Mayor Jenny Durkin and Lisa
Right.
Herbold around.
Looked like we were right on the brink of it last year. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, nothing really happened there. And so I think for myself and probably other people, it's a bit of a believe it when I see it kind of situation. It's sort of it's interesting because on the one hand, it feels like this should be easier to do than it is because there are models out there.
Right. Right.
We talk about Eugene and the Cahoots program a lot. We talk about Denver a lot.
STAR program. Yep.
The STAR program. So it's not like there are not models out there to do this.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I think it would be a mistake to underestimate how difficult it will be to hire people to do this. And I think there's a lot of retraining. I think that the most challenging part in some ways will be the dispatch side, which is,
I was going to say,
how do you train people and how do you distinguish between calls that need a cop and calls that don't?
Can I jump in at this point? Because that was a really interesting part of this whole term sheet here. There was this idea of, okay, we're going to develop this matrix of how calls need to be handled or whatever else. They're going to bring in a third-party vendor to try to figure some of these things out. But then when it said implementation date, TBD. And that was something that really jumped out at me because you can talk about changing it a lot, but when it comes down to that actual decision point, I think you're right. That's the most difficult part of this. How do you change how these 911 decisions are made? And that's even before you set up these different units that could go out to help.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think underlying all of this is staffing shortages at every level. The dispatch across the state, really across the country, is down to pretty skin and bones levels at this point. So they're just trying to keep up on that front. Obviously, police numbers are down. You talk to any service provider who, in theory, would be the sort of world that maybe you would draw from to staff this kind of response. Most of these service organizations are down too. I mean, there's just kind of a dearth of staffing at every level, which is just going to make what was already going to be sort of a complicated process more complicated.
Yeah, no, I think so too. And there's a lot more complication behind the scenes. I mean, we've got a new police chief coming in. There's going to be a new leader of the Community Safety and Communication Center, our 911 dispatch, kind of coming on this fall too. The lingering labor issues with the SPOG contract there. I think you're right, David. This whole idea of setting up a pilot program always sounds simple to begin with, but so many different moving parts here. So we'll see what happens here. I guess bottom line for you, just briefly on this, what do you think it's going to take to make a program like this successful? A broad question, but some basic thoughts on that, please.
I think clarity and communicating that. Who's gonna, if you call 911, who's gonna show up? And is it going to be obvious? I mean, I think already that's a problem. You hear lots of stories about people who see someone overdosing or someone in a mental health crisis, and they think, "Who can I call?" They call 911, and then police show up, and they're like, "Well, I didn't really want police to show up."
Yeah.
So can you create a system where the help that people are seeking is the help that actually arrives? And does it arrive in a fairly expedient timeline? And do they provide legitimate help? Those are all pretty big questions, and will take a lot of working out to make sure the answer to those is yes.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of big questions around this, but I will say on a positive side with this, if you're watching this whole debate go on between the mayor and the city council, it looks like there is some progress here. So we'll see what happens over the next few months. We'll see what comes out of the mayor's budget actually in a couple of weeks here to see if any piece of this is included too. So a lot to keep track of there. We'll keep track of it right here on the show. All right. Well, we've got something coming up here next, a major state highway shutdown, a fire season that really has taken a nasty turn here in the early part of September. What's been going on with the Bolt Creek fire on Highway 2? David's been working on this. He's breaking it down on Transportation Talk. David, you and several other reporters from the Times have been taking on some very challenging work covering the Bolt Creek fire that shut down Highway 2 for several days now, forced a number of evacuations. What's that coverage been like? What have you been doing? What's going on with that? It just seems like a massive, massive fire we're talking about that's shutting down a massive part of the state transportation system.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's so challenging and surprising about this story is you sort of expect big wildfires that move quickly in drier parts of the state, but this is happening on the wet side of the mountains, and so when I first wrote about it, I was on call on Saturday, just for like a pre-scheduled shift, and sort of like, oh, there's this fire, I guess we should write about it. And so when I first wrote about it, it was about 20 acres, and then by the end of the day, it was at over 1,000. So the fact that it's growing as fast as it is, you can't. The response is really a lot more challenging because it's not, on prairie fires or things like that, you can dig fire lines and you can, it's easy to bring equipment in and out. This is mountainous terrain. You can't dig a fire line through second growth forest. And you have one road in and out. It's literally on top of a mountain. It was windy, so they couldn't get helicopters up in the air for a while. So, it's scary because it's new, but also you come with it the sense that maybe this isn't going to be abnormal going forward. And we've been very fortunate this fire season not to have more wildfire activity. I got to say that for sure. Yeah, absolutely. But even in the past, when we've had wildfire activity, a lot of it is fires from California or eastern side of the mountains or parts of BC or whatever. And so the fact that this is coming from an area that's, if you drive out there, it's sort of borderline rainforest during the winter. Right. It's very wet, index and all that. So I mean, I think it raises a lot of questions. One thing I've been sort of following is just around like resiliency of these areas. There's not a lot of, there's just that one road in and out, and there used to be another road, but King County at one point decided not to rebuild it after it washed out. Wow. That I know has been causing a lot of concern for people up there, which is, this is going to be the new normal. We gotta come up with some redundancy in this system because there's rocks and debris and trees falling on this highway where there's like a tunnel at one point that can easily be blocked. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why this is a scary situation for the people that live out there. And so I think it raises a lot of questions, about as fires and disasters like this maybe become more common, how do you kind of build out that resiliency and keep people safe? And briefly, just shutting down Highway 2, that's not a small decision. Can you talk about that and what impact you've seen from that? No, of course, it's not a small decision, but in some ways it wasn't a difficult decision either. I mean, there's they literally have heavy machinery parked on the side of the road so that every hour or so they can move all the debris that's falling on the road. So it's fairly clearly unsafe, but we've seen this before when sort of major routes around the area shut down. You kind of realize how easily cut off some parts of Western Washington and these areas are. I mean, so when you shut off Highway 2, which is anyone who's come back from a weekend trip on east side of the mountains knows how busy that road gets. And so then, you still have I-90, of course, but it's one of probably 3 or 4 kind of major arteries coming in and out of Western Washington. And so the lose that is pretty significant. Yeah, no, massive to see that. And I appreciate the coverage there, but it's time to wrap up here. And I had to catch up on something on your Twitter feed that might be ever so slightly natural disaster related here. Do you really have a Mount Rainier is not erupting t-shirt is the first question. And second, why do you feel the need to wear it? What's going on, man? No, I don't actually have that t-shirt, but it was there's just sort of this funny bit where when you when you learn about some kind of when people say like, don't worry, I'm not, this terrible thing is not happening, when you never knew that terrible thing was supposedly could be happening in the first place. It's just this kind of running joke about the t-shirt meme. So no, I don't actually have that, but maybe I should get a Mount Rainier is not erupting t-shirt. I think I could wear that. You could rock that, man, and keep us all calm. So yes, this just in, Mount Rainier not erupting, but please be careful out there, folks. It's been a crazy end to the summer here. Well, David, thank you so much for joining me as always. Thanks to everybody out there listening. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on all the major platforms. Thank you for listening. And once again, if you are a listener, please do support the show on Patreon. We could not do it without you. Thanks also to Converge Media. We will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.